Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. There are certain words that politicians absolutely love. Efficiency, flexibility, local control, streamlining, cutting red tape, eliminating waste. And look, none of those things are bad. Nobody wakes up in the morning hoping the government will be less efficient. Nobody says, you know what this country really needs? More unnecessary paperwork. Nobody is out there waving little flags that say bureaucracy forever. So when a politician says they're cutting waste or reducing unnecessary regulations, the natural reaction is to think, good, it's about damn time. But here's the thing. Government policy almost always sounds better from 30,000 feet. Reducing regulatory burdens sounds clean. Providing local flexibility sounds reasonable. Targeting benefits more efficiently, that sounds downright sensible. But what you almost never hear is what those phrases look like when they land. Nobody holds a press conference and says, we're going to make it harder for some 6-year-olds to get lunch. Nobody has an announcement that goes, we're going to loosen the rules about how many preschoolers one adult can supervise. Nobody puts out a glossy fact sheet with information like, we saved money because somebody else is going to have to pick up the bill. That's not how Washington talks. Washington talks in abstractions. It talks about programs and grants and eligibility thresholds and administrative burdens. Meanwhile, somebody out here in the real world has to live with whatever those words actually mean. And right now, as kids are about to head back to school, some of the decisions that have been bouncing around Washington for months are beginning to show up somewhere a lot less abstract. At the cafeteria, at the after-school program, inside the preschool classroom, in the counselor's office, in the stack of forms somebody's parent now has to fill out. So today I want to do something pretty simple. I want to take all of those beautiful Washington words, efficiency, flexibility, local control, cutting red tape, and follow them all the way down, past the press release, past the budget spreadsheet, past the talking point, until we get to the schoolhouse door, because that's where we find out what they actually mean. Greetings, neighbors, and happy Wednesday. You're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today, we're going to be talking about what happens when Washington's vocabulary collides with an actual school day. Because this is not an episode about how every federal education program is wonderful and every federal regulation is sacred. Some regulations are dumb. There's no other way to say it. Some reporting requirements deserve to die quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere. And if the federal government is spending money badly, I, for one, absolutely want somebody to find it and fix it. However, that means we have to be precise about what's happening. Some of the things we're going to talk about today are already affecting schools and families. Involve grants that were canceled. Some involve changes to eligibility. that can ripple into completely different programs. Those distinctions matter. So I want to take the administration's argument seriously. If they say they're cutting red tape, fine. Show me the red tape. If they say they're giving local programs more flexibility, okay. Show me what that flexibility now allows them to do. And if they say they're saving money, that's where I really want to slow down, because saving money can mean you found a better way to do the same job, or it can mean you stopped doing part of the job. And those are two completely different things. So today we're going to follow these policies all the way down from Washington to the classroom and see what changed on the other end. Now, before we get into what Washington is changing, I think we have to answer one more basic question. Why is Washington involved in this stuff in the first place? Because education in America is overwhelmingly a state and local responsibility. Your school board isn't taking orders from some guy sitting behind a desk at the Department of Education every time they decide which math book to buy. And there's a perfectly reasonable conservative argument that says, good, let's keep it that way. Local communities know their schools. States have different needs. A rural district in Pennsylvania is not the same as a school system in Houston or Boston or Los Angeles. Fair enough. But the federal government didn't gradually become involved in education because somebody in Washington developed an uncontrollable urge to micromanage third grade reading groups. A lot of that involvement came because there were big problems the country eventually decided could not be left entirely to local discretion. Take Title I. That goes back to 1965 and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The basic idea was pretty straightforward. Schools serving lots of low-income children often had fewer local resources, so the federal government would provide additional money intended to help close that gap. Today, Title I still directs federal assistance towards schools and districts serving large numbers or percentages of children from low-income families. Then you have special education. Before Congress acted in the 1970s, millions of children with disabilities were either excluded from public schools entirely or were not receiving appropriate educational services. The law that eventually became IDEA established a federal guarantee that eligible children with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education and the special education and related services that they also need. That's not Washington deciding whether the middle school day should start at 7:45 or 8:15. That's Washington saying, no, you don't get to decide that this kid is too difficult or too expensive or too inconvenient to educate them. Head Start came out of the war on poverty in the 1960s, built around the idea that children from low-income families could benefit from more than somebody teaching them their ABCs for a couple hours a day. It was designed as a comprehensive program tying early education to health and nutrition and family services. And then there's school lunch. The federal government has been involved there since the National School Lunch Act, which was signed in 1946. Today, the program helps schools provide free or reduced price meals to children who qualify. Now, none of this proves that every federal rule written since 1946 is brilliant. It doesn't even prove that every federal rule written last Tuesday was brilliant. Government programs accumulate requirements. Requirements accumulate forms. Forms develop subforms. And somewhere, eventually, there is probably a person whose entire job it is to explain why Box 14B can't be left blank, even though nobody has looked at Box 14B since the Carter administration. That stuff happens. But there's a reason I wanted to start here, because when we hear the phrase return control to the states, it sounds like we're resetting everything to some natural default where local communities handle local matters and everybody goes home happy. Historically, it's a good bit more complicated than that. A lot of federal involvement came after the country looked at what happened under purely state and local control and decided some people were getting left behind. Poor kids, children with disabilities, kids facing discrimination, kids whose families didn't have much money or political influence to start with. And that creates the tension we're going to keep running into today. Local control can be good. Local experimentation can be good. Washington can absolutely overreach. But sometimes a national rule exists because we decided there were certain things a child should not lose simply because of the state or town or school district or zip code where they happened to be born. So before we start cutting Washington out, I think it's fair to ask, why did we invite Washington in? Because once you know the problem a rule was supposed to solve, you're in a much better position to decide whether that rule is useless or just pure bureaucracy, or whether we're about to rediscover the problem that created it in the first place. So let's descend down from federalism and civil rights law and all that big picture stuff for just a minute. Let's talk about lunch. Because if you want to understand how one change in Washington can travel through 3 different government programs and eventually land on a cafeteria tray, this is a pretty good example. So imagine you're a parent. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but put your parent hat on for right now. Last year, your kid went to school, got in the lunch line, grabbed a tray, and ate. No application, no lunch account to monitor, no wondering whether you remembered to send $20 in on Monday, no conversation with your kid about whether they qualify for free lunch or whether their friend does. Everybody in that school ate. That's possible in thousands of schools because of something called the Community Eligibility Provision. And yes, that is exactly the kind of federal program name that sounds as though it should come with a 3-ring binder and a complimentary bottle of aspirin for the headache it's going to give you. So forget the name for a second. Here's basically how it works. Schools serving sufficiently high concentrations of lower income children can provide breakfast and lunch to everybody without making individual families submit meal applications. Instead of determining eligibility child by child, the government uses other information it already has, including whether students are participating in programs like SNAP, to identify the economic need in that school. The idea is pretty straightforward. If you already know a school serves a large population of kids whose families are receiving public assistance, maybe you don't need to make every one of those families prove it again so their kid can eat lunch. It's less paperwork. Interesting phrase, right? We'll be coming back to that. But here's where SNAP enters the picture. If a child lives in a household receiving SNAP, that child can generally be directly certified for free school meals without the family having to file a separate meal application. And those directly certified students also help determine whether a school can participate in that universal meal option. So now follow the chain. Change SNAP eligibility. Fewer families participate in SNAP. That means fewer children are automatically identified through SNAP for school meals. That can change the calculation schools use for universal meal programs. And suddenly, a law that Congress debated as a change simply to food assistance for households is now affecting how lunch works in a public school. And that's not hypothetical. Houston Independent School District is dealing with exactly this as the new school year begins. 33 Houston schools are no longer participating in the federal universal free meal program this year. More than 35,000 students attend those schools. Breakfast will remain free, but families who want free or reduced price lunch now have to qualify individually and submit the necessary information. Houston area SNAP enrollment has also fallen substantially as the newer federal eligibility rules have taken effect. Now, stop there for a moment. because there's a counter argument, and I don't think it's ridiculous. Why should taxpayers buy lunch for every kid in a school if some of those kids come from families perfectly capable of buying lunch themselves? And that's a fair question. If you have limited government resources, why not target them? Feed the kid whose parents can't afford lunch. Let the family making $200,000 a year buy their own chicken nuggets. And I understand that argument, and targeting benefits can absolutely reduce the amount of government spending on people who don't financially need the assistance. But there's another word for targeting: means testing. And means testing is not free. It means applications, verification, processing, parents supplying information, schools collecting information, employees reviewing it, families being notified, changes being reported, mistakes being fixed, people appealing decisions. And then there are families who qualify but never complete the process. Maybe they don't know they qualify. Maybe they miss the form. Maybe the form goes home crumpled beneath 3 worksheets, a field trip permission slip, and something sticky at the bottom of the backpack. Anybody who's ever raised a child knows that elementary school backpacks are where paperwork goes to enter the witness protection program. And none of that means that universal lunch is automatically a better policy. It means the comparison is a good bit more complicated than free lunch for everybody costs more, free lunch only for poor kids costs less. You have to count the machinery required to decide who is poor enough. You have to count the families who fall through the cracks. You have to decide whether there's any value in a cafeteria where every kid simply gets in line and eats without the school needing to sort them by household income. And there can also be stigma when school meal systems distinguish between children based on family income. Although how visible that distinction is varies depending on how a school administers the program. I don't want to get melodramatic about this and pretend that every kid receiving free lunch is walking around with a flashing sign over their head. But I know it's in my local area that there are people who don't apply for free school lunches who qualify because of the stigma attached. Friction matters, participation matters, and access matters. So already, with something as ordinary as lunch, we've run into the question that's going to follow us through this whole episode. You can make a government program cheaper by narrowing who gets it. That may be a policy you can defend, but it's not the same thing as finding a cheaper way to provide the same benefit. One is efficiency, the other is eligibility. And once you see that distinction, the next question gets harder. Because lunch is about who gets the service, but what happens when Washington starts changing what the service itself has to include? And that brings us to Head Start. And this is where the word bureaucracy gets a lot more interesting. Now, I want to slow down here because Head Start is where the whole argument stops being theoretical. A lot of people hear Head Start and think preschool for poor kids. And that is part of it. But Head Start has traditionally been much broader than that. The federal standards cover education, health, mental health, nutrition, family engagement, developmental needs, and other services intended to address the fact that poverty doesn't conveniently show up in only one part of a kid's life. A 4-year-old doesn't arrive at preschool as a little isolated academic unit. They may need vision screening. Maybe there's a developmental delay nobody has caught. Maybe the family needs help connecting to services. Maybe there's a dental problem. Maybe the parent needs support navigating the school system. That broader structure is one of the things that has historically distinguished Head Start from simply saying, here's a preschool classroom, see you at 3. And now the Trump administration wants to rewrite a huge portion of the federal rulebook governing how that program operates. Now, important distinction here. There are 2 separate Head Start proposals. and I need to keep those straight. The first came in May. That proposal targets workforce rules adopted in 2024 that would eventually require Head Start programs to provide things like salary scales, greater wage comparability with public preschool, health coverage, paid leave, and certain other employee benefits. Those requirements were scheduled to phase in over several years. The Trump administration argues that they're just too expensive, too prescriptive, and go beyond what the Head Start statute itself requires. And if I'm being totally honest, there is an argument there. Head Start has limited money. If Washington tells a local program, you must increase compensation and benefits, but then Congress doesn't provide enough additional money to cover it, the program has to find that money somewhere else. The administration estimates that removing those future wage and benefit requirements would avoid about $2.1 billion in expenditures once fully implemented. And it calculates that as many as 106,000 Head Start slots could otherwise be lost to pay for those requirements. Now, notice what I said there. The administration estimates. That is its model. Those 106,000 children have not already been kicked out of Head Start. The wage requirements themselves are not fully in effect yet. This is a projection about what could happen under the previous rules if additional funding doesn't arrive. But it presents a genuine dilemma. Would I rather have a Head Start teacher making better wages with decent benefits? Absolutely. Would I also rather have 106,000 kids retain access to Head Start? Again, absolutely. Well, congratulations. Welcome to governing. Sometimes the choices suck. But here's what I don't want us to do. I don't want to call avoiding those wage costs efficiency without saying what the savings actually are. Part of the savings comes from not requiring programs to spend that money on its staff. That may preserve slots. It may give local programs more flexibility, and you can defend those things. But if the teacher receives less compensation than he or she otherwise would have received, the cost didn't evaporate into the atmosphere. The worker absorbed part of it. That's the policy choice. And then there's the second proposal. This one was released just days ago, and it's much broader. The administration is proposing to rescind more than 1,400 provisions in the current Head Start performance standards and replace them with a much shorter federal framework. HHS, my favorite department, HHS says the existing rules have become too detailed, duplicative, and prescriptive, forcing local programs to focus too much on procedural compliance instead of direct services. The proposal would shift more authority to states and local programs. Okay, I'm listening. Now, show me the red tape. Here's where the administration does have examples that deserve consideration. Some existing Head Start regulations repeat requirements that already exist in Head Start in the Head Start Act itself. The proposal identifies areas where statutory requirements would remain binding even if duplicate regulatory language disappeared. It also proposes removing some prescriptive instructions about exactly how programs have to carry out community coordination, transition planning, and other administrative processes while leaving broader statutory duties in place. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say I'm perfectly willing to cut actual red tape. If Congress already requires you to do something, and the regulation underneath is basically restating the same requirement in 12 additional paragraphs, then fine. Get out the chainsaw. But that is not all this proposal does. The administration would also move decisions about things like group size and adult-to-child ratios toward state and local standards instead of maintaining the Head Start-specific federal requirements. It would remove or loosen detailed federal rules governing family engagement, screenings, service structures, and other parts of the program. And now suddenly reducing bureaucracy starts to mean something very, very different. Because an adult-to-child ratio isn't paperwork. Put the regulation binder away for a second. Picture the room. 2-year-olds, actual 2-year-olds. One is crying, one needs the bathroom, one has decided that today is the perfect day to see whether Play-Doh fits inside the electrical outlet. Another has apparently declared war on socks. The number of adults in the room matters. It matters greatly. The administration's own economic analysis says part of the projected savings from the August proposal would come from changes in staffing and service delivery. It estimates that those savings could be reinvested into additional Head Start slots. At full implementation, its primary estimate is roughly $2.2 billion in annual effects, potentially supporting more than 160,000 additional Head Start and early Head Start slots by 2031. And again, that sounds pretty darn compelling. More kids, same pot of money. Who's against that? But look underneath the number. Some of the projected savings come from personnel spending. Some can come from larger groups or fewer staff. Some come from changes to how services are delivered. The government is not claiming it discovered $2 billion in toner cartridges nobody needed. It's changing what programs are required to provide. And this is where I keep coming back to that restaurant analogy. So, suppose I own a restaurant with 10 servers. I fire 3. Now, the other 7 each handle more tables. My labor cost goes down. I can serve the same number of customers with fewer employees. Hell, maybe I can even lower prices and attract more customers. On the spreadsheet, I have become dramatically more efficient. Meanwhile, one waiter is responsible for 25 tables. Someone has been waiting 40 minutes for their mozzarella sticks, and table 12 is considering, eating the centerpiece. Did I become more efficient? Maybe. Or maybe I lowered the quality of the service enough to make the numbers work. Those are not automatically the same thing. And the administration itself acknowledges another example. Under the August proposal, some Head Start programs could reduce the number of hours they operate compared with current federal standards. HHS says that gives programs flexibility to design schedules around local needs. It sounds like a fair argument, but the rule also explicitly acknowledges that if programs choose shorter hours, parents may have to find additional childcare or miss work. And there it is. That's exactly what I mean by following the policy all the way down. The federal program saves money. The regulation disappears, the spreadsheet improves, and somewhere else, a parent who is figuring out who can watch their kid from 2:30 until 5 is bearing the burden. The cost didn't disappear, it just moved. Now, none of this proves the existing Head Start rulebook is perfect. It clearly isn't. There are areas where the administration can make a legitimate case that federal regulations duplicate statute or prescribed processes local programs could design for themselves. Good. Cut those. But a classroom size limit is not the same thing as a duplicate reporting requirement. A health screening is not the same thing as a redundant regulatory paragraph. A teacher's benefits are not the same thing as an unnecessary form. And if we're going to use the same word for all of that stuff, bureaucracy, then that word stops telling us anything useful. So I think Head Start gives us the harder question. Not should we regulate more or regulate less, but what exactly are we calling red tape? If removing a rule allows you to serve more children, that matters. But so does what those children receive when they get there. And the phrase, we expanded access, is only half a sentence. The other half is access to what? So Head Start gives us one version of this argument. What happens when Washington changes the standards inside the program? But there's another version. What happens when Washington doesn't loosen the rules around a service? What happens when Washington simply stops paying for it? And this is where I want to talk about something called the Full Service Community Schools Program, which, as a government program, as names go for government programs, is almost aggressively boring. Full Service Community Schools Program. That sounds like something you'd skip past in a 400-page appropriations bill without even slowing down. But the actual idea is pretty easy to understand. The federal government provides grants to schools and local organizations to connect ordinary classroom education with other services students and families may need. The Department of Education describes the program as supporting academic, social, and health services through partnerships between schools and community organizations. In practice, depending on the school and the grant, that can mean tutoring, after-school programs, mental health counseling, family support, healthcare, food assistance, attendance programs. Sometimes it's the person helping a family figure out why their kid has missed 30 days of school. Sometimes it's the counselor that the child gets to talk to. Sometimes it's the after-school program that keeps a child somewhere safe until a parent finishes work for the day. That's what I mean when I say follow the money all the way down. Because earlier this year, the Trump administration canceled about $168 million in full service community school grants, affecting programs across 11 states and Washington, D.C. The administration objected to DEI-related language and priorities contained in some of the original grant applications, arguing that the projects no longer aligned with current federal educational priorities. And here again, I want to be careful because it would be really easy to just turn that into they hate DEI, so they killed tutoring. That's catchy, but it's also too sloppy. The administration's objection was to what it viewed as a race-conscious or ideological component of these grants. And if federal grant money is being used in a way an administration believes violates federal law or improperly favors people based on race, the federal government absolutely has a responsibility to examine that. Fine. So let's examine it. But then ask the next question. Was the objection to the entire program or to one part of the grant application? Because in Idaho, for example, officials protested that the DEI-related language the administration objected to had already been removed and that the disputed DEI work had never actually been carried out. The state still lost the remaining grant funding. That's where this becomes more than a culture war argument. Because when you cancel a grant, you don't surgically remove the phrase you don't like from page 47 or whatever. You remove the money. And whatever the money was paying for now has a problem. At one Connecticut school highlighted by the Washington Post, the canceled federal grant had been supporting an expansion of after-school programming. After the federal funding disappeared, staff were laid off and programs, including arts and dance activities, were reduced. Other affected grants supported mental health services, tutoring, and care coordination. Connecticut eventually stepped in with millions in emergency state funding to keep some of those programs going. And there's another phrase that we should put under the microscope. The federal government saved money. Well, did it? From Washington's perspective, yeah, the federal expenditure stopped. But Connecticut had to turn around and say, essentially, we still need some of this stuff. So the state had to find the money. Now, that's not automatically bad. Maybe Connecticut should be paying for it. Maybe local communities should have more responsibility for these programs. That's a perfectly legitimate policy argument. But again, the cost didn't disappear. It just moved. Federal taxpayer became state taxpayer. The school district, nonprofit, parent, somebody. And sometimes nobody picks it up at all. That matters because a grant called the Full Service Community Schools Program is incredibly easy to treat like a line item. The administration eliminated another federal grant program. Well, okay, what did the grant buy? That's the question. Because full service community schools program sounds like something invented by 12 consultants in a conference room. The place my kid goes from 3 until 5 because I don't get off work until then. Well, that sounds a good bit different. It's the same dollars, just a very different perspective. And notice how this builds on what we were talking about with Head Start. With Head Start, Washington can say, we're giving the local program more flexibility. And maybe it is. In this case, Washington can say, we're no longer funding a program that conflicts with our priorities. And maybe that is entirely within the administration's authority. But the analytical question still stays the same. What changed on the other end? Did the objectionable activity disappear? Did the tutoring disappear too? Did a state replace the money? Did a nonprofit pick it up? Did the counselor lose the job? Did the after-school club simply vanish? Those are not details around the edges. Those are the policy. I'm not even arguing that every service paid for by one of those grants was effective. The fact that somebody labels something mental health support doesn't automatically mean that it was working. The fact that a program helps poor kids doesn't mean that it shouldn't be evaluated. If the program wasn't producing results, then show me. If part of the grant violated federal law, fix it. If the spending was wasteful, cut it, but don't hide the ball. Tell me what the government stopped buying. Because now we've seen 3 different ways Washington can make itself smaller. It can narrow who qualifies, it can loosen what a program is required to provide, or can simply just stop paying for the service. And every one of those can be defended under the banner of smaller government. Which brings us to the bigger question we've been circling since the beginning. Maybe Washington really is doing too much. Maybe states and communities should be making more of these decisions themselves. Maybe all these federal rules, grants, and conditions really have gotten out of hand. Okay, let's make that case, and let's make the strongest version of it that I know how to. So up to this point, we've mostly been following the consequences of federal changes. Now, I want to do something that can be uncomfortable in political commentary. I want to make the strongest case I can for the other side. Because there is a real argument that Washington has gotten too involved in education. Not a cartoon version, not the Republicans hate kids version, an actual argument. Start with the Constitution. Education is not one of the powers specifically assigned to the federal government. Public education in America has historically been built and run primarily by states and local communities. And there's a practical reason for that. As I mentioned earlier, schools are different, communities are different. A rural district here in PA has different transportation problems and staffing problems and enrollment patterns than a giant urban district in Texas. A local superintendent may understand those realities better than somebody writing a rule in Washington. None of that is crazy. And once the federal government spends money, the money almost never arrives alone. It comes with rules and reporting requirements and eligibility standards and data collection, audits, applications, compliance reviews. Sometimes those requirements protect people. Sometimes they make sense, and sometimes they consume time and staff that could be doing something else. And this is the part where I have to admit that I think conservatives have a point. Government is very good at layering rules on top of rules and then forgetting to take the old ones away. A requirement gets added because of a scandal, then another one gets added because of a lawsuit, and another one gets added because somebody wants better data, and 20 years later, the person running the program is spending Thursday afternoon uploading the same information into 3 different federal systems that apparently refuse to speak to one another. That's not imaginary. And if you can eliminate that kind of duplication, do it. Please, by all means. There is also a legitimate argument about experimentation. If Washington establishes one highly detailed national model for how a program must operate, states and local communities have less room to try something different. Maybe one state figures out a better staffing model. Maybe another develops A more effective partnership with local clinics, maybe a rural community, needs a completely different schedule than one in a big city. You don't get innovation if every answer has already been prescribed. And then there's money. We need to be honest about this too. Spending more does not automatically mean producing better results. You can absolutely spend more money badly. You can create programs that exist because they've always existed. You can fund initiatives that sound wonderful on paper, generate lovely reports, and accomplish virtually nothing. There is no progressive principle requiring us to defend ineffective government. I am not for ineffective government. If a program doesn't work, fix it or kill it. If a regulation costs a fortune and produces no meaningful benefit, get rid of it. If the local government can provide the same service more effectively than Washington, by all means, let it. I'm not interested in defending bureaucracy as a lifestyle choice. And there's another argument that is especially important with Head Start. Suppose a federal standard really does make each slot more expensive. And suppose Congress does not provide enough funding to maintain that standard and serve every eligible child. Then something has to give. You can preserve the standard and serve fewer children. You can loosen the standard and serve more children. Or Congress can spend more money. But pretending that limited resources never create trade-offs doesn't make them disappear. That is the strongest version of the case for pulling Washington back. And I can definitely see why a person could believe in it. Where I break with that argument is when local control becomes the answer before we've asked what the problem the federal rule was solving was. Because not every federal requirement is there because Washington thinks it knows best. Some are there because local systems failed certain groups over and over and over again. That's the complication. The same local control that allows innovation also allows variation. And sometimes variation's great. Sometimes one state does something brilliant and everyone else then gets to copy it. But sometimes variation means the kid in one state gets protection that the kid across the border doesn't get. So the real question is Washington good or is Washington bad? That's almost useless. The real question is which decisions genuinely belong close to home and which protections are important enough that there should be a national minimum. Once you remove the federal rule, you haven't eliminated that decision. You've just handed it to somebody else. And then we have to ask what happens when 50 different states make 50 different choices. So let's follow that one all the way through. Suppose Washington backs away, not from everything, but from more of these standards, more of these requirements, more of the decisions. What happens then? Pennsylvania sets one standard. Massachusetts sets another. Mississippi another. Texas another. Some states may decide the old federal requirement was too weak and go further. Others may decide it was too expensive and scale it back. Some communities may innovate. Others may just struggle. That's federalism. And federalism is not inherently sinister. In fact, one of the strongest arguments for it is that 50 states can become 50 laboratories. One state tries something new and it works, others copy it. That can be a big strength of the system. But there's another side to 50 laboratories. You can also end up with 50 different floors. And that matters a lot more when we're talking about children who don't have much ability to choose which laboratory they were born into. Take a child with a disability. Under IDEA, eligible children with disabilities are guaranteed a free, appropriate public education throughout the country. States and local school systems still make enormous numbers of decisions about how those services are delivered, but the basic right itself doesn't depend on whether your state legislature happens to be enthusiastic about special education. There is a federal floor. It's the same thing with civil rights. Federal law doesn't dictate every school policy, but it does say that programs receiving federal finance cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Other federal protections address discrimination based on disability. Again, it's a floor, not a federal government sitting in Washington deciding which kid sits in which chair, but establishing a minimum. And I think that distinction gets lost constantly in these debates. Because federal control, the phrase federal control, sounds like Washington is trying to run your school. And sometimes it is trying to control too much, but sometimes what we're really talking about is Washington simply saying, below this point, you cannot go. You can spend more, you can provide more, you can build something better, but you cannot provide less than this. Which brings us right back to Head Start. If the federal government says we're no longer going to set a specific Head Start ratio, we'll defer more to state and local standards, that does not automatically mean children will suddenly be packed into rooms like carry-on luggage. Some states may already have strong standards. Some programs may voluntarily keep the old ones. Some may do better, but others may not. And once Washington stops setting that floor, the quality of that protection depends more heavily on where the child happens to live. That's the trade-off. And I have to admit, this is where I think progressives sometimes make the argument badly. We say national standard as though national automatically means better, and it doesn't. A stupid national rule is still stupid. A badly designed federal standard can impose costs everywhere at once, and a local program may know far more about what works in its community than anybody in Washington is ever going to know. But the opposite mistake is assuming that local automatically means responsive, efficient, and humane. That local automatically means better. History gives us plenty of reasons not to make that assumption. Local governments can innovate. They can also discriminate. They can prioritize children well. They can also underfund kids who are expensive to serve. They can create excellent programs, but they can also decide that a service costs too much and hope somebody else handles the consequences. That's why the real argument is not Washington versus freedom. It's about where we want the minimum to be set and who gets hurt if we set it too low. Think about two kids with the same disability, same educational needs. One happens to live on one side of a state line. One lives 10 miles away in another state. How different are we comfortable allowing their basic protections to become? Or two low-income 4-year-olds in Head Start. Should one be guaranteed a particular staffing level while the other gets whatever standard their state happens to require? Maybe your answer is yes. Maybe the benefits of local control are worth that variation. That is at least an honest argument. But then say it plainly. Because returning flexibility to the states sounds very different from we are comfortable allowing different states to guarantee different minimum levels of service. Those sentences are describing the exact same policy, or they can be describing the exact same policy. One describes the mechanism, the other describes the consequence. And now we finally arrive at the phrase I've been working towards this whole time. A floor is not a ceiling. A federal minimum does not mean every state has to stop there. It means nobody falls below it. And whether we're talking about disability rights or civil rights protections or school nutrition or Head Start, the real debate should be about where that floor begins. Not whether Washington is always right. It isn't. Not whether states are always better. They aren't. The question is, what do we believe every child should be able to count on regardless of where they live? Once we answer that, then we can argue about who's best equipped to provide everything above that point. All right. And now that we followed eligibility standards, services, and federalism all the way down, I think we're finally in a position to go back to the word that started the whole thing. Efficiency. I think now we can ask the question politicians should have to answer every single time they brag about savings. Fine, show me the savings. Not the slogan, not the press release, not the line of the budget table with a nice green number next to it. Show me what changed. Because if you tell me a regulation cost $100 million a year and produced virtually no benefit, I am fine with that. Kill it. If two agencies are collecting the same information from the same school in two different formats, fix that. If a federal rule is so prescriptive that local programs spend more time proving compliance than actually helping people, it should be simplified. I'm not emotionally attached to paperwork, but that is exactly why we have to be more precise about what counts as waste. Because there are three very different things government can do and call it savings. It can become genuinely more efficient, it can provide less, or it can make someone else pay. Those are not the same thing. If a Head Start program can provide the same level of care, the same quality, the same services, and do it with fewer administrative costs, awesome. That is efficiency. If a school can get rid of duplicative reporting and redirect those hours towards students, great. That is efficiency. But if the savings come because the classroom gets larger, if the program cuts its hours, if the worker gets fewer benefits, if fewer families qualify, if a counselor disappears, if the state has to replace the federal money with its own, then don't hand me the word efficiency and expect the conversation to be over. That may still be a defensible choice. Maybe you think the federal government should spend less. Maybe you think states should pick up more of the responsibility. Maybe you think a particular service is worth less than the money it costs. Okay, make that argument, but make the actual argument. Don't just tell me you saved $100 by canceling dinner and then act like you found a cheaper grocery store. You didn't become more efficient, you stopped buying dinner. And that's the distinction I think is buried in almost every one of these arguments about government spending. Politicians love to talk about dollars leaving the federal ledger. I want to know where the obligation went. Did it disappear because no one needed it? Or did a state absorb it? Or did a parent absorb it? Or did a worker absorb it? Or did the service just vanish? Those are the receipts. And this is where I think the administration's argument survives in some places and fails in others. There are real examples of duplicative requirements and overly prescriptive rules. Those deserve to go. There are also changes where the quote-unquote savings clearly come from lowering what the federal government requires or funds. That is not the same achievement. And by this point, I think we've earned the right to say that plainly. Fairness does not mean pretending every side of every policy argument is equally persuasive forever. You examine the argument, you test the evidence, then you reach a conclusion. So when somebody in Washington says we cut waste, my answer is fine. What was the waste? Specifically, what was the waste? When they say we reduced bureaucracy, okay, which requirements disappeared? And when they say we saved taxpayers' money, say, okay, but who's paying now? That's not cynicism. It's basic accountability. And once you start asking those questions, a lot of political language gets a whole lot less slippery, I think. So let's go back to where we started. Efficiency, flexibility, local control, streamlining, cutting red tape. None of those words are meaningless. Sometimes they describe exactly what government should be doing. Government should be more efficient. It should get rid of pointless rules. It should stop making people fill out the same freaking form 3 times. It should let communities solve local problems when they're better positioned to do it. But whenever somebody tells you they eliminated waste, don't stop there. Follow the money. Past Congress and past HHS and the Education Department and the governor past the superintendent, all the way down until you find the thing that changed. Maybe it really was useless paperwork. Great. Good riddance. Maybe it was a lunch. Maybe it was a screening. Maybe it was a counselor. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe it was a smaller classroom. Maybe it was a benefit that made it easier to keep qualified staff. Maybe it was a federal responsibility that quietly became a state responsibility or a local responsibility or a parent's problem. And that doesn't automatically mean the change was wrong, but it does mean we deserve plain English. If government found a better way to do the same job for less money, call that efficiency. If it stopped doing part of the job, then call that a reduction. If it handed the bill to somebody else, that you call transfer. Don't just blur all three together and call the whole thing waste. Because eventually, every policy lands somewhere. On a form, on a paycheck, in a classroom, at a lunch table, in a family's budget. That's where the real argument begins. So tell us what you cut, and then let us decide whether it was worth cutting. All right, everyone. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I would love to hear from you about this, what your thoughts are on this subject, or any subject for that matter. I told you at the beginning of the episode the ways you can get in touch with the podcast, and I wish that you would. Friday is the next episode, so it will be a Back Porch Files episode. I hope you'll download and listen. So between now and then, do me a favor, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.